your eyes open before sunrise. Not because you're disciplined, because you're anxious. The world outside is quiet, but your thoughts are already moving. And maybe, just maybe, you're here for the same reason I am, to leave that noise behind for a while. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going back to a time of stone towers and silent prayers, of river roads and handwritten wisdom. This is medieval Europe, and this is your quiet escape. The sun sets on a world once held in the firm grip of the mighty Roman Empire. For centuries, this vast dominion had stretched across continents, its roads carved deep into the land, its laws etched into marble and memory, its armies marching like waves upon the shores of history. But now, the empire crumbles. The familiar stones of its roads crack. The statues weather and tilt. The order that once pulsed like a great river through Europe begins to ebb away. And in its place, new streams begin to form. Gentle, uncertain, slow, like rainwater pooling in fresh places after a long storm. And so we begin our gentle downstream journey, drifting into a time historians call the Middle Ages, a period nestled between the echoes of Rome and the dawning light of the Renaissance. This chapter in our human story did not arrive suddenly. No great bell rang out to announce its beginning. It unfolded like mist rising from a quiet lake, almost unnoticed, soft and gradual. As the power of Rome dissolved in the 5th century, Europe became a patchwork of smaller kingdoms and territories. Without the structure of the empire, each region began to shape itself anew, like rivers carving their own paths through soft earth. Some regions flowed swiftly, forming early nations. Others pooled into isolated valleys, untouched by outside influence for generations. What was once one unified current became many tributaries, branching out in all directions. And with this divergence came change. Life grew more local. Cities emptied. Roads grew quiet. Trade slowed. And yet, there was not only decay. There was adaptation. There was survival. There was new life. The people of this time, though scattered and uncertain, began to rebuild. Farmers tilled the land just as their ancestors had, but now without the oversight of Roman law or Roman coin. Rulers rose, not from imperial appointments, but from battles fought and loyalties sworn. Languages shifted, evolving into forms both familiar and strange. Latin faded into French, Spanish, Italian, and more. Like different streams fed by the same spring, they drifted apart, yet remained connected in their origins. This was a time of transformation, not just in power and politics, but in how people saw the world. Imagine the landscape: vast forests stretching for miles, broken only by the winding paths of travelers. Quiet valleys dotted with humble villages. Ruined Roman towns, half swallowed by ivy, where children played among fallen columns. Castles yet unbuilt. Cathedrals yet undreamed of. And above it all, the steady, rhythmic passing of time, like water lapping against ancient stone. There were no smartphones, no engines, no global news. Life moved slowly, at the pace of seasons, of harvests, of sun and shadow. And in this slowness, there was space for tradition, for myth, for faith. In the early Middle Ages, knowledge dimmed in many places, like lanterns flickering in the wind. The great libraries of Alexandria and Rome were no longer the centers of thought. Books became rare, copied by hand, kept safe in distant monasteries. But though the flame of learning burned low, it did not go out. It glowed quietly, waiting for its time to shine again. Outside the monasteries, most people lived close to the land. They rose with the sun, slept with the stars. Their lives were shaped by earth, weather, and ritual. Fields were planted with songs. Bread was baked in silence. Even death was met with prayer and fire. And though these people left few written words behind, their lives mattered. Each one, like a drop of water, played its part in shaping the flow of history. As we drift further into this world, let us not think of it as dark or ignorant. Let us think of it as quiet, slow, forming, like a river beginning in distant mountains. At first, it's just melting snow, trickles, springs. But soon, it will gather strength. It will carry with it villages, trade, language, art, and eventually, change. For now, we rest here, at the source. The Middle Ages have begun, not with the crash of thunder, but with the soft hush of shifting tides, and so we drift gently onward. The world we enter is not yet filled with knights in shining armor or towering cathedrals. That will come. For now, there are farmers with calloused hands, elders with long memories, and families huddled close in wooden homes. They do not know they are part of something history will name and number. They only know the land, the seasons, the silence. Their kingdoms are small. Their maps are smaller. But their lives form the bedrock of all that is to come. As one era ends, another begins. The Roman world is gone, but its echoes remain. Its bridges still arch across streams. Its roads still guide footsteps. Its words still whisper in Latin prayers and legal codes. It is not dead. It has transformed. And from its remnants, a new Europe will rise. A Europe of feudal lords and serfs, of monks and merchants, of pilgrims and poets, a continent not yet united, but beginning to pulse with new rhythms. And so we begin our gentle downstream journey, through forests and fields, through faith and famine, through castles and cathedrals. The Middle Ages stretch before us, like a river winding far into the horizon. There will be bends. There will be still waters. There will be rapids. But always, there will be motion. And tonight, as you lie back and let your mind wander, know this: history, like water, always flows. And in the calm current of this story, we float together. The landscape continues to shift as we drift further into the heart of the Middle Ages. The empire is gone, and with its retreat, power has fragmented. Left behind are islands of land and leadership, scattered across the wide terrain like stones in a slow-moving stream. And from these stones, something new begins to take shape. Feudalism, a word that might seem cold or distant to us now, but in its time, it was not just a system. It was a way of life, a great web connecting people, land, duty, and survival. Like an intricate river delta, feudalism spread across Europe, each stream feeding into the next, carrying obligations instead of water, loyalty instead of leaves. Picture the land, divided not by fences or straight lines, but by oaths. At the highest point of this flowing structure stood the monarch, the king or queen, whose power flowed outward like the headwaters of a river. Below them, great lords and nobles held vast lands, not truly theirs by ownership, but granted to them in return for loyalty and service. These nobles were like wide, still lakes, gathering influence, sheltering those below them, yet always connected to the greater flow above. In return for their fiefs, parcels of land, they pledged knights and armies, shelter and counsel. And so the current moved downward again, to the knights. These warriors, armored and sworn, stood as protectors of the realm. But even they were not at the bottom of this great system. At the base of this pyramid of promises stood the peasants, the serfs, the laborers. They were the tributaries, the trickling streams that fed all the rest. They tilled the fields, baked the bread, built the walls, raised the children. Year after year, they poured their effort into the soil, into the land that rarely bore their names. And yet, they were not without meaning. Their work was the pulse of the countryside, steady and unbroken. Like the rhythm of soft waves brushing against a riverbank, their efforts were the quiet heartbeat of an age. Feudalism wasn't just a political structure. It was emotional, spiritual, practical. It offered safety in an age of uncertainty. In the absence of an empire, feudal bonds created order. It told people where they belonged, who they owed, and who owed them in return. Every person had a place, not always fair, not always free, but steady. From peasant to noble, from vassal to monarch, each person flowed into the next like linked streams, each feeding and being fed in turn. If one dried up, others suffered. If one flooded with greed or war, others were swept away. And so balance, however fragile, was maintained. The manor was the center of this system's life. It was not just the home of the Lord, but a miniature world, surrounded by farmland, woodlands, and perhaps a small church. It operated like a self-sufficient island in the wider current of Europe. On this manor, the Lord governed, the peasants worked, the steward recorded, and the blacksmith, the miller, the carpenter, all contributed their unique drops to the pool. Taxes were paid not in coins, but in crops and labor. Bread was baked in communal ovens. Justice was dispensed not by grand courts, but by the manorial hall. Life was local, close, repetitive. But within this structure there was familiarity. There was the comfort of knowing what each day might bring. The sunrise, the fields, the animals, the seasons, the church bell. Everything returned, like a circular stream flowing back upon itself. Even the architecture of the manor reflected this looping rhythm. The longhouses where peasants lived were often built of wood, straw, and earth, materials drawn directly from the surrounding land. They blended with the landscape, as if grown from the very soil. Lords' manors, by contrast, were sturdier, sometimes fortified with stone, standing like small fortresses of control. Yet even they were humble compared to the castles that would come later. Here, in the early to high Middle Ages, power was not about gold crowns or royal courts. It was about land and the ability to hold and protect it. And so, as the centuries flowed on, feudalism spread. It adapted to different regions: England, France, the Holy Roman Empire. It rose high in some areas, flowed shallow in others, but always the structure remained: land, loyalty, labor. In its ideal form, feudalism was a contract of mutual support. Lords protected, vassals served, peasants worked. Everyone gave something. Everyone received something. Like a network of rivers, each part relied on the strength and movement of the others. But like all rivers, it could be disrupted. Droughts came in the form of war. Floods came in the form of famine. And sometimes the system itself became stagnant, when lords abused their power or peasants had nothing more to give. Yet even then, the system endured for centuries. Why? because it fit the world around it. In a time without strong central governments, without fast communication, without wide-reaching armies or modern banks, feudalism was the bridge across the water. It kept Europe afloat through dark and uncertain tides. Even art and literature of the time reflected this hierarchy. Songs of knights and lords, tales of oaths and betrayals, prayers for those who tilled the land. Even within faith, there was a feudal-like structure, priests, bishops, popes, each serving and leading. And so, generation after generation, people were born into a flow already moving. Most never questioned it. Like a stream joining a river, they accepted their direction and moved with it. A child born to a peasant family would likely work the same fields as their parents. A noble's heir would inherit lands and titles, and the duties that came with them. Up and down the social stream, everyone learned their place by watching those before them. But this system, like all things, was not eternal. One day, the rivers would shift again. Trade would return. Cities would rise. Kings would seek more power. And the structure that once seemed unshakable would begin to bend and break. But for now, it holds. For now, the waters of Europe flow calmly through manors and fields, under the watchful gaze of feudal lords and humble laborers, each one playing their part in this medieval ballet of loyalty and survival. And as we continue to drift gently through this world, we begin to understand not just how people lived, but how they belonged, how their lives were interwoven, like roots beneath a calm stream, hidden, quiet, but strong. This is the world we float through now, a world of duty and design, a world shaped by land and loyalty, a world where power flowed not through gold, but through the soil beneath one's feet. And so the waters now guide us toward the villages and manors, to the places where this great system was lived, day by day, season by season. We float onward. The path now narrows. We leave behind the Lord's manors and stone-walled halls, and drift softly into the fields, where wildflowers sway in the breeze and quiet lives unfold among furrows and hedgerows. The great river of history, once filled with kings and warriors, now runs through smaller, gentler streams, the homes of common folk, the peasants and farmers who shaped the land with tired hands and ancient tools. Welcome to the medieval countryside. Here, in these scattered villages and simple hamlets, life moved not with the speed of armies or the urgency of politics. It moved instead with the rhythm of the earth, slow, seasonal, sacred. It rose with the morning dew and settled each evening with the smoke from hearth fires. It was the heartbeat of the Middle Ages, and its pace was steady as ripples on a quiet lake. The countryside was not one place, it was many. It stretched across the rolling hills of England, the meadows of France, the dark forests of Germany, and the open fields of Poland. And yet, no matter the region, its spirit remained constant, close to the land, rooted in survival, and steeped in tradition. Villages were small clusters of life, often no more than a dozen or 24 homes, arranged in no grand pattern, just huddled together like stones in a stream bed. Between them, winding dirt paths connected houses, barns, gardens, and the parish church, which rose humbly above the rooftops, offering a spiritual anchor to the community. The homes themselves were simple, modest timber-framed huts, with wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs. Inside, there might be 1 or 2 rooms, a fire pit for cooking, and straw bedding for sleep. Chickens pecked at crumbs underfoot. Tools hung beside the hearth. The smell of wood smoke clung to every surface, like a memory that never faded. These were not homes of wealth or grandeur, but they were homes of warmth, of endurance, of quiet joys. Outside, the land itself was divided into strips, worked communally, and rotated with care. Some plots grew wheat or barley, others bore beans or turnips. All were sown and harvested by hand, back bent, fingers blistered, sun high overhead. The plow, pulled by oxen, carved its slow path, and behind it, seeds were dropped like prayers into the waiting earth. Life here was labor. Every season brought a new demand. Spring was for planting. The ground, softened by rain, welcomed seeds that would grow into the year's sustenance. Summer was for tending. Weeds had to be pulled, fences mended, tools repaired. The sun baked the fields, and skin browned under its glare. Autumn was for harvest. The village gathered together, young and old, to cut the grain, stack the sheaves, and thresh the bounty. It was the busiest time, but also the most joyful. Songs were sung, bread was baked, cider flowed. Winter, then, was for rest. The fields slept. The people huddled close. It was a time for mending clothes, telling stories, and listening to the howling wind beyond the cottage walls. Each year turned like a wheel, and people turned with it. The days were full of repetition. Fetch the water, feed the animals, gather kindling, mend the roof, sweep the floor, bake the bread. But within this repetition, there was a certain peace, a rhythm, a ritual. Just as a river may flow through the same stones each day, never bored, never rushed, so too did these people find purpose in their routines. Children were born into this world not with fanfare, but with gentle acceptance. They grew up knowing the call of the rooster, the smell of fresh-cut hay, the stories passed down from grandparents beside the fire. Their toys were sticks, their games played in meadows. Their laughter was the music of the village. Education, in the formal sense, was rare, but wisdom flowed freely. A mother taught her daughter how to grind grain, weave wool, and treat small wounds with herbs. A father showed his son how to plant straight, how to shoe a horse, how to read the sky for signs of weather. Knowledge passed like water, quietly, consistently, without books, but never forgotten. Festivals were moments of brightness in this otherwise steady flow. Feast days marked the calendar with bursts of color and sound. People wore their best clothes, often no more than their cleanest, and danced in the village square. There were maypoles in spring, bonfires in summer, harvest feasts in autumn, candle-lit masses in winter. These were times when the hard edges of life softened, and joy bubbled up like a spring breaking through the ground. Yet life was not easy. Illness was always close. A bad harvest could mean hunger. A cold winter could take the weak and old. Medicine was basic. Doctors were rare. And yet, people endured. They leaned on each other. A neighbor's bread could become your supper. A widow's roof might be repaired by the village boys. There was suffering, but also solidarity. And always, there was nature. Nature was not just a backdrop. It was a companion, a ruler, a mystery. The forest loomed at the village's edge, full of deer and danger. Rivers brought water, fish, and the fear of floods. The sun ruled the day, and the moon lit the night. People read the world in birdsong, in hoofprints, in the direction of the wind. They believed in signs, in spirits, in the sacredness of certain trees or stones. Faith blended with folklore, and the countryside whispered with legends. There were tales of fairies in the glen, Ghosts in the woods, blessings from wells, curses from strange travelers. This was a magical realism of their own making, half hope, half history. The church, too, was always nearby. Its bell marked the hours. Its priest offered comfort, confession, and the word of God. Though Latin prayers might go misunderstood, the message was clear. Live humbly, work well, pray often. The countryside, then, was not just where people lived. It was where they belonged. It was not grand. It was not fast. But it was full of life, of growth, of struggle, of grace. And it was the base upon which all else in the medieval world rested. Castles may have stood tall. Knights may have ridden far. But it was the countryside that fed them, clothed them, supported them. Without the farmers, the weavers, the shepherds, and the blacksmiths, there was no kingdom, no court, no church. And still, the currents invite us to explore more. As we drift from these fields and villages, let us carry their memory gently. Let us remember the barefoot children, the bent-backed elders, the young mother kneading dough by candlelight. Let us carry the scent of fresh hay, the sound of distant bells, the golden hush of a harvest sunset. Their world was quiet, but not empty. It was slow, but not stagnant. It was poor, but never without purpose. In their still waters, we see our own reflections, reminding us that the greatest strength often lies not in motion, but in patience, not in power, but in presence. And now, as we let the wind carry us from the farmland to the steeples beyond, we follow the current into the next chapter of medieval life. A world shaped not just by soil and sun, but by faith. The stream curves gently now, leading us away from the earthy toil of the countryside, toward a quieter, deeper current. A current not of rivers or fields, but of faith. In the heart of medieval Europe, before cities bustled or cathedrals soared, before scholars debated and kings declared, there stood something constant, something silent and towering, even when made of humble stone. The church, not just a building, not just a priest in robes, but a presence, a guide, a quiet force, shaping lives like water shapes rock, with persistence, with patience, with time. Imagine now, drifting slowly toward a small village chapel. Its wooden doors creak with age. A candle flickers near the altar. Outside, the fields stretch wide, but inside, the air is still, cool, heavy with incense and whispered prayers. The voice of a lone monk echoes faintly. A hymn drifts through the rafters like morning mist over water. This is where many medieval lives were centered, not just in birth and death, but in every moment in between. From the grand cathedrals in the heart of cities to the tiniest chapels on windswept hills, the church was a gentle but all-encompassing stream, flowing into every corner of daily life. Its bell marked the rhythm of the day. Its teachings shaped what people believed was right or wrong. Its priests interpreted the world through scripture and sermon, and its rituals, from baptism to burial, were the stepping stones on life's winding path. Faith, in the Middle Ages, was not merely a belief. It was a worldview, a lens through which all things were seen, from the changing of seasons to the outcome of a battle, from the failure of a harvest to the birth of a healthy child. All were wrapped in the fabric of divine will. People believed that God watched over them, not as a distant being, but as a presence woven into the very air they breathed. Angels walked among them. Saints heard their prayers. Miracles, curses, blessings. They were not metaphors, but truths. The church taught not just theology, but meaning. It explained why suffering existed, as a test, a punishment, or a path to salvation. It taught that heaven awaited the good and obedient, and that hell stood ready for the sinful. These ideas were not meant to scare, they were meant to guide. Like signs posted along a foggy riverbank, they offered direction in a world where so much felt uncertain. And for many, this was comforting. When the crops failed, they prayed. When illness spread, they lit candles. When a child was born, they gave thanks. When death came, as it often did, they turned to the church for hope that the soul would pass safely beyond the veil. The church was not one thing, but many. It was the parish church, where villagers gathered each Sunday. It was the monastery, where monks and nuns copied books, cared for the sick, and lived lives of quiet discipline. It was the cathedral, a towering structure of stone and stained glass, built over decades, sometimes centuries, as an offering to heaven itself. It was also the voice of Rome, the Pope, seated in a distant city, yet influencing the decisions of kings. But most of all, it was a thread, binding all of medieval Europe together in a shared spiritual current. No matter how remote a village, or how vast a kingdom, all were part of the same faith. Priests played a central role in this stream of belief. Though they were often as humble as the peasants they served, they held the sacred authority to perform rites, baptisms, marriages, last rites, and to deliver the teachings of the Church. Many were the only ones in the village who could read Latin, and so they became both spiritual leaders and community anchors. They heard confessions, gave counsel, delivered sermons drawn from centuries of Scripture. Their presence was steady, like a lantern in a dark forest path. Monks and nuns, meanwhile, stepped away from worldly life entirely. In stone monasteries or quiet convents, they rose before dawn, prayed by candlelight, and spent their days in silence, study, and service. Some tended gardens, others taught children. Many copied manuscripts by hand, ensuring that knowledge, both religious and classical, would survive into future centuries. In a world where few could read or write, these monastics were the keepers of memory. Their ink and parchment flowed like rivers of preservation, carrying ancient wisdom forward across generations. They believed that, through discipline and devotion, they were drawing closer to God, like tributaries seeking their source. The Church also provided structure and charity in a world often marked by hardship. It cared for the poor, the orphaned, the sick. In many places, the Church was the only institution offering food, medicine, or refuge during times of famine or war. The monastery doors were open not just to those seeking God, but to those seeking bread, healing, or safety. And when people died, the Church was there again, to pray for their souls, to bless the grave, to ring the bell that echoed into the silence. But even with its calm and guidance, the Church was not perfect. It held power, great power. Land, wealth, influence over rulers and empires. And like any great river, its current could turn strong, sometimes sweeping people into control, corruption, or fear. There were priests who sought profit over purity, bishops who lived more like lords than shepherds, popes who tangled with kings for authority. But for every one of these, there were many more who lived in humility, walking dusty roads, healing wounds, speaking softly to the grieving. The Church, in all its forms, was vast and human. It stumbled, but it also lifted. It divided at times, but more often it united. And above all, It endured. Our journey continues. The gentle current carries us from the sacred echo of church bells to a quieter, even more hidden place. A place far from battlefields, far from courts, far from the noise of the marketplace. A place where silence itself is sacred. We drift now toward the stone walls of a medieval monastery, not a fortress of war, but of wisdom. Tucked away in valleys, perched beside rivers, or nestled in forested glades, monasteries were the still ponds in the flowing river of medieval life. Their purpose was not to fight or rule, but to preserve, to protect the fragile flicker of human knowledge in an age often defined by darkness. And so, we follow the flow, to where ink meets parchment, and prayer meets study. A monastery, at first glance, may seem plain. Stone walls, low archways, a simple chapel, perhaps a bell tower, a walled garden, a well, a cloister, a covered walkway, always square, enclosing a small patch of green. But within these walls was a world of structure, a life shaped by bells and books, silence and repetition. The monks who lived here had left behind the outside world. They had chosen a life of devotion, discipline, and quiet. Their days were shaped by the rule of Saint Benedict or similar codes, which instructed them when to rise, when to pray, when to work, and when to reflect. Their days began before the sun, in darkness and candlelight. Matins, lauds, prime, terce sext, none, vespers, compline. These were the hours of prayer, gently spaced throughout the day, each one a moment to pause, to breathe, to reflect. Life in a monastery was not fast, it was not loud, it was intentional. And between these hours of prayer, there was work. Some monks tended gardens and orchards, cultivating food not just for themselves, but for the poor. Others brewed ale or crafted tools. Some healed the sick with herbs and poultices, offering shelter and kindness to weary travelers or wounded strangers. But in many monasteries, especially the great ones, there was a different kind of work taking place. The copying of books. We enter now the scriptorium, a room with tall windows, built to catch the softest rays of light. The air smells faintly of parchment, ink, and wax. Silence reigns here. The only sounds, the scratch of quills on vellum, the turning of pages, the whisper of robes. A monk sits hunched at a desk. He is copying, letter by letter, line by line, a book written centuries before. Maybe it's a gospel, maybe it's a medical text by Galen, or a philosophical treatise by Plato, or a book of poems, riddles, or astronomy. Each letter is drawn with care, sometimes illuminated, gilded with gold, flourished with bright blues and reds, twisting vines and mythical beasts dancing in the margins. The monk does not rush. He does not skim. His work is slow, deliberate. Because he knows, this book might be the only copy left in the world, and if his hand falters, that knowledge may vanish. In this way, monks became guardians of memory. They preserved not only scripture, but science, not only hymns, but history. In a time when most of the population could not read, and when books were so rare they were chained to desks, monasteries were like deep reservoirs, holding the knowledge of civilizations long gone. From the ruins of Rome to the wisdom of ancient Greece, from medical insights of the East to theological debates of the present, monks wrote, translated, and preserved it all. They were not inventing new ideas, but keeping old ones alive. They were like still pools, quietly collecting the rain of centuries. Some monasteries became great centers of learning. Places like Monte Cassino in Italy, Cluny in France, Lindisfarne in England, and later, the Irish monasteries that preserved so much classical knowledge during the chaos of the early Middle Ages. These institutions were not merely religious, They were intellectual sanctuaries. Pilgrims came not just for blessings, but for instruction. Young boys were taught to read, to count, to sing in Latin. And though most peasants would never set foot inside, the effects rippled outward. For every book copied in a monastery, a future mind might be sparked. A future healer, poet, or reformer might be born. The beauty of the monastery was not only in its purpose, but in its simplicity. Life here was a reflection of the monastic ideal. Ora et labora, pray and work. There was no chase for riches, no ambition for fame. There was only the slow, sacred flow of days. A walk in the cloister, tracing the same path hundreds had walked before. A meal eaten in silence, with scripture read aloud from a wooden pulpit. A moment in the chapel, kneeling in candlelight, while a storm raged gently outside. But even this quiet world had its moments of struggle. Not all monks were devout. Some grew lax. Some monasteries grew too rich, owning land, collecting tithes, wielding influence. At times, the church itself had to reform the monasteries, reminding them of their original calling: humility, service, simplicity. Yet despite these flaws, the greater truth remained. Monasteries were the memory banks of medieval Europe. When cities fell and empires burned, their books remained. When war shattered kingdoms, their songs survived. When famine and plague swept the land, their candles still flickered. In an age of uncertainty, the monastery was a still place, and in stillness, there is power. And so, as we drift past the stone arches and quiet gardens, let us pause and give thanks to those whose names we'll never know. The nameless monks who gave their lives to silence and ink, who lit no fires of revolution, but kept alive the faint, flickering flame of knowledge. They remind us that not all heroes ride horses. Some sit at wooden desks, bent over words, pouring wisdom onto parchment, one letter at a time. The stream flows onward now. From these sacred sanctuaries, the waters ripple outward, toward noise, toward growth, toward change. The quiet gives way to markets, to ships, to trade. And as the rivers carry goods, so too do they carry ideas, once preserved in stone rooms, now spreading through towns like pollen on the wind. We follow now the flow, to medieval cities growing by the riverside, to a world in motion once more. The river moves again, leaving behind the cloisters and candlelit halls of the monasteries. We begin to hear something new in the distance. Faint at first, like a breeze rippling across water. Then louder, a wheel turning, a cart creaking, voices calling, laughter echoing through narrow streets. This is not the silence of prayer. This is the hum of life gathering, of towns awakening, of commerce stirring, of people and purpose weaving together into something new. We are arriving now at the banks of growing medieval towns, towns that rise slowly like sandbars in a shifting tide, built first from need, then from opportunity, and finally from ambition. They were not planned by emperors. They emerged organically, like wildflowers blooming along trade routes, river bends, and crossroads. They are living currents, and we now drift through them. In the early Middle Ages, Europe had grown quieter. Cities once bustling under Roman rule had emptied or shrunk into shadows of their former selves. Roads crumbled. Markets vanished. Life returned to the land, to the manners, to the silence. But the world does not stay still for long. By the 11th and 12th centuries, change was stirring. The population grew. Agricultural techniques improved. Crop rotation, iron plows, and better harnesses meant more food. And more food meant more people. And more people meant more trade. And so, movement returned to the map. What had once been isolated villages slowly connected. A merchant here, a craftsman there, a farmer selling surplus grain, a blacksmith looking for buyers. People began gathering, first in temporary markets, then in seasonal fairs, and finally in permanent towns. These towns were small at first, but vibrant. Nestled beside rivers, at the foot of castles, or near monasteries, they began as outposts of exchange. But they grew, street by street, stall by stall, until they pulsed with their own rhythm. A rhythm not of seasons, but of trade. A different kind of heartbeat now filled the air. Coin striking coin, hammers against anvils, voices calling out goods from shop windows. Picture now such a town. Cobblestone streets twist like tiny streams, winding between timbered houses that lean toward each other as if whispering secrets. In the early morning, vendors unpack their carts in the market square, laying out fruits, cloth, pottery, cheese, honey. Children run barefoot, chasing chickens. A bell rings from the church tower, smoke curls from chimneys, and the smell of baking bread fills the air. As the day warms, the streets grow busy. There's the shoemaker, his hands worn but skillful. The weaver, selling fine wool dyed in colors pulled from plants and minerals. The tanner, the barber, the butcher, the candlemaker. Each profession, each trade, a small tributary feeding the town's lifeblood. Guilds soon rise, organizations of craftsmen and merchants. They set standards for quality, protected their members, passed down knowledge through apprenticeships, and together they created a new kind of identity, not one of birth or title, but of skill. A man might be born a peasant, but if he became a master blacksmith, he earned status in this bustling, buzzing world. For the first time in centuries, Europe's towns offered something rare: social mobility, a shift in the stream. And then there is the merchant, the traveler, the trader. He arrives from distant lands, his cart full of silk, spices, tin, wine, or salt. His stories are as valuable as his wares. He speaks of the ports of Venice, the markets of Constantinople, the golden sands of Africa, the cold trade roads of the north. He ties Europe together, thread by thread, reminding the people that the world is wider than their walls. And so, towns become nodes of connection. From Bruges to Lübeck, from Genoa to Ghent, towns rise not just as places to live, but as places to link. Roads are repaired, bridges are built, ships set sail. The river of Europe, once fractured, begins to flow again. The trade routes of medieval Europe form like veins. The Hanseatic League in the north binds towns through the power of the sea. The Champagne fairs in France become legendary for their scale and splendor. In the south, cities like Florence and Venice grow rich through trade with the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. Goods move, but so do ideas. With every sack of grain, every bolt of cloth, every crate of salt, there comes conversation, curiosity, change. New methods, new words, new tastes, new tools. The marketplace becomes a mirror, not just of material wealth, but of intellectual awakening. Yet, these towns are not just centers of trade. They are also centers of freedom. While the countryside is bound by feudal ties, many towns win charters, documents granting them certain rights. The right to govern themselves, the right to trade without interference, the right to hold courts and defend their walls. In towns, laws are written, not inherited. Citizens have roles, not as vassals, but as members of a community. This is a quiet revolution, one brick at a time. The phrase, "town air makes you free," becomes a saying across Europe. For some, fleeing the burdens of feudal life, towns become a place of rebirth. Here, one might find not luxury, but liberty. Still, medieval towns were far from perfect. They were cramped. Narrow streets, no sewage systems, open gutters. Disease moved swiftly, especially in times of plague. Fires could spread with terrifying speed, devouring entire neighborhoods built of dry timber. Crime lurked in the shadows of alleyways, and not all who came found success. Many struggled, many failed, but even in hardship, towns offered something new: the chance to change your fate. The chance to wake each morning not to the toll of obligation, but to the promise of possibility. And so, the great shift begins. Europe is no longer a patchwork of fields alone. It becomes a tapestry of towns, woven together by roads, rivers, ships, and stories. The monastery kept knowledge, the church kept faith. But the town began to keep momentum. It was messy, loud, alive. And with every passing year, it pulled more people into its current. Farmers, craftsmen, thinkers, wanderers. The river was no longer quiet. It rushed forward, toward change, toward growth, toward modernity. We drift now toward the next great structure of this world. Not made of timber, not made of trade, but of stone, towering, watchful, silent, strong. Castles and fortresses, places of defense and dominion, of protection and power. But even here, beneath the battlements and banners, the river still flows. Because every stone placed, every wall raised, every gate opened or closed, was touched by the people whose lives moved alongside it. The current shifts again. We leave behind the bustling towns and busy markets, the sound of merchants calling and hammers striking iron. As the stream flows further, the noise fades, replaced by stillness. And then, rising from the hills, like islands in a vast green sea, we see them. Castles, stone giants of the landscape, watchful, patient, silent. They rise above the treetops, above the rivers, above the villages, anchored into cliffs, perched on hills, nestled beside streams. Some are modest, just stone towers with wooden walls. Others sprawl like sleeping dragons, layers of stone, curtain walls, ramparts, towers, and keeps. Each one different, each one enduring. And so, the waters ripple onward to majestic heights. In the early Middle Ages, before castles dotted the hillsides, Europe was vulnerable. Raids from Vikings, Magyars, and Saracens swept through unfortified lands like sudden storms across open fields. People needed protection, more than wooden walls or prayers could provide. And so, out of necessity, the castle was born. At first, these were simple moti and bailey structures, an earthen mound, the moti, topped with a wooden tower, and a lower enclosed yard, the bailey, for animals, storage, and people. Surrounded by ditches and fences, they were quick to build, but easy to burn. But as years flowed by, wood gave way to stone. Walls thickened, towers rose higher, gatehouses became stronger, keeps turned from simple residences into fortresses of might. These were no longer temporary shelters. They were statements of power and of permanence. To those who lived in their shadow, a castle was many things. It was a symbol of the Lord's strength, of the king's authority, of safety from chaos beyond the walls. It was a refuge, a place to flee when war came or bandits raided. It was also a command center, from where taxes were collected, justice was delivered, armies were mustered. But more than anything, it was a world unto itself. Let us now drift through the stone gates of one such castle. A drawbridge creaks as it lowers over a moat. The portcullis groans as it rises. and beyond it lies a courtyard, bustling with life. Blacksmiths hammer out horseshoes near the stables. Children chase chickens between carts of grain. A well stands in the center, where servants gather water, and towering above it all, the great keep, the heart of the castle. Thick-walled, narrow-windowed, built to withstand siege and time. Inside, it is cold but dry. Tapestries line the stone walls. Wooden tables rest beneath chandeliers made of iron. The hearth blazes with a fire that fights off the chill. This is where the lord and his family live, alongside their guards, clerks, and servants. Their lives are not lavish, but fortified. Everything in a castle serves a purpose. Narrow stairs spiral clockwise, so defenders above, usually right-handed, can swing swords more freely. Murder holes in the ceiling of the gatehouse allow defenders to drop stones or hot oil on attackers. Arrow slits are angled to give archers a wide field of fire while remaining shielded. Even the walls curve slightly, helping them deflect blows and prevent collapse. Every stone was placed not just to build, but to resist, to endure. And yet, within these walls of war, life continues. Banquets are held in the Great Hall, not daily feasts, but celebratory meals on holy days or after victories. Laughter echoes between the walls. Minstrels play. Dancers spin. Stories are told of heroes, saints, and ancestors. In quieter moments, the castle chapel offers a space for prayer and reflection. The Lord hears petitions from peasants in the hall. A marriage is arranged. A land dispute is settled. A knight receives his orders, and children learn their lessons. Boys training to ride, to hunt, to fight. Girls taught to sew, to sing, to manage the household, all raised to maintain the legacy of the stone they live within. Castles were also places of expectation. For young noble boys, the castle was a school for knighthood. At age 7, a boy might become a page, serving a noble household, learning manners, horsemanship, and letters. At 14, he would become a squire, training with weapons, serving his lord, learning the code of chivalry. And finally, if proven worthy, he would kneel before a sword and rise as a knight, a warrior of both skill and virtue, sworn to protect, to serve, and to uphold honor. Girls, too, were trained for roles that, while different, were no less vital. A noble woman might oversee the household, manage servants, care for the sick, and ensure the castle ran smoothly in her husband's absence. Many were literate, some were powerful regents, and some, like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Matilda of Tuscany, shaped history from behind castle walls. Not all castles were noble homes. Some were military outposts, manned by soldiers, built to guard borders or claim new land. Others were administrative centers, collecting taxes and watching trade routes. Some were symbols of oppression, built to control rather than protect, looming over recently conquered lands, reminders of who held power. To the peasants who worked the fields beyond the walls, a castle could be a protector or a prison. To travelers, it might offer shelter or suspicion. And to enemies, it was an obstacle, a mountain of stone that could only be taken by siege. Sieges were slow, brutal affairs. Castles could withstand months without surrender, thanks to thick walls, deep wells, and stocked stores. Attackers tried to starve them out, batter them down, tunnel beneath them. Defenders dropped stones, shot arrows, poured boiling water. It was a battle of endurance, not speed. And often the castle endured, because stone remembers what men forget. Over time, castles evolved. By the 13th and 14th centuries, they became more ornate. Walls grew higher, towers rounder, gates more complex. Inner courtyards became gardens, rooms became larger, windows brighter. They were still strongholds, but also homes of status. Architecture blended with artistry. Carvings adorned lintels, stained glass caught the morning light. Heraldry marked each hall. These changes reflected a world beginning to shift, from constant war toward a growing thirst for culture, refinement, identity. The fortress was still a symbol of power, but now also of legacy. And so, castles remained, rooted in the landscape. Even when gunpowder made their walls less secure, even when kings centralized power and rendered many obsolete, even when stone gave way to court palaces and urban strongholds, still, many stood. Some crumbled, vines creeping up their sides, their stories whispered by the wind. Others survived, renovated, repurposed, restored. But all of them, in one way or another, endured. Let us now float past the outer walls, watching the flags ripple in the wind. We leave behind the ramparts and the guards, the kitchens and the keeps. We carry with us the memory of a world built not just to shelter, but to last. Castles were not merely buildings. They were anchors in time, holding steady when the rivers of history surged too hard, too fast. And from these high walls, we sail further into the lives of the people. Not the lords and ladies, but the warriors sworn to serve them. The knights who lived by the sword, but pledged to live also by a code. Chivalry, a current of honor, discipline, and purpose, running beneath the armor, the lance, and the blade. From the stone towers of castles, we drift outward once again, our current now tracing a quieter path, lined not by rivers or roads, but by stories. Stories of courage, of duty, of oaths taken in candlelight and upheld on distant battlefields. We enter the world of the knight, not just the armored figure from tales and tapestries, but the real men beneath the steel. Some noble, some flawed, all shaped by a single flowing idea, chivalry. And so the stream now carries us to roads of faith and purpose. The word chivalry comes from the Old French chevalerie, meaning horsemanship, drawn from cheval, horse. In the beginning, a knight was simply a mounted warrior, trained in combat, swift on horseback, skilled with sword and lance. But over time, this role became something greater. As medieval Europe matured and castles stood firm, the figure of the knight evolved, not just a soldier, but an ideal. A model of bravery, loyalty, and morality. Knighthood came to mean more than strength. It meant service, not just to a lord, but to a higher code. Imagine the journey. A young boy, born into a noble family, begins his path to knighthood not on the battlefield, but in the Great Hall. At age 7, he becomes a page, a child servant in a lord's household. He learns to read, write, speak politely, serve meals, play the harp, and tell stories. He is taught the ways of the church, the rules of courtesy, and how to care for arms and horses. It is a quiet beginning. His world is filled with observation, discipline, reverence. At age 14, he becomes a squire. Now the lessons turn sharper. He trains daily in the courtyard, learning to wield a sword, to aim a lance, to mount a war horse. He dons armor not yet his own. He helps his lord dress for battle, rides beside him in hunts and skirmishes, and watches, always watches, what it means to stand firm, to lead, to hold honor in the face of danger. And then, if found worthy, he is dubbed a knight. Sometimes after a campaign, sometimes on a holy day. sometimes kneeling before a monarch. A sword touches each shoulder. He rises not just as a warrior, but as a guardian of values. So, what were these values? The code of chivalry, though never written in one place, flowed through every part of a knight's life. Loyalty to one's lord, one's king, one's comrades. A knight was expected to be unshakable in his duty. Courage, not just in battle, but in standing for what was right. In protecting the weak, even at great risk. Courtesy, especially to women, elders, and the innocent. Kindness was not weakness, it was discipline, justice, to fight not for conquest, but for cause, to use strength in the service of the good. Faith. A knight's sword was often blessed, his battles seen as spiritual struggles. He was to be devout, prayerful, humble before God. Generosity, to share one's riches, one's food, one's time, to show mercy to the defeated. These were the rivers that fed the idea of knighthood, not always followed, but always upheld as the ideal. Knights became icons. Bards sang of their bravery. Poets wrote of their loves. Tales of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table spread across Europe. The Holy Grail, Excalibur, Camelot. These were not just fantasy. They were aspiration. Every knight, it was said, should aim to be like Arthur's champions, just, wise, noble, and pure of heart. Of course, reality often wandered from legend. Some knights were cruel, ambitious, reckless. Some fought for gold, not glory. But even flawed, they were bound by expectation, by the eyes of their peers, by the weight of their vows, and in that pressure, many found purpose. Knights were also expected to serve the people. Though born into privilege, they were taught to protect the weak, to stand between danger and the defenseless. Peasants, merchants, pilgrims, these were not their equals, but they were their responsibility. In times of war, a knight's first duty was to defend his lord's land and people. In times of peace, he might help settle disputes, patrol roads, or escort travelers. Some even founded orders, groups of knights who dedicated their lives to service. The Knights Templar guarded pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. The Hospitallers offered care to the sick. The Teutonic Knights brought military strength to remote Christian frontiers. These were not merely warriors. They were monks in mail, fighting not for kings, but for faith. In armor, a knight was a fortress of iron. Mail hauberks gave way to plate armor, polished steel that covered every limb. Helmets were crested. Shields bore coats of arms. Lances lowered in charge, swords raised in defense. But beneath all that was a man, with fears, with fatigue, with flaws. Many died young. Others lived to see their ideals tested again and again. Some fell into corruption. Others rose to sainthood. And some, many, simply lived and died as servants to their time. Not famous, not remembered, but steady, like quiet stones beneath the stream. Not just a name, but a legacy. And though the world would eventually change, guns replacing lances, kings replacing lords, ideals bending to modern needs, the memory of the knight would endure. Because the idea of knighthood, courage paired with conscience, strength paired with service, flows deeper than any single age. Tonight, as we drift further down the calm river of medieval life, let us remember these armored men, not only for the battles they fought, but for the values they tried, however imperfectly, to embody. Let us see beyond the steel, to the vow made in silence, to the page's first lesson, to the squire's first scar, to the knight's last prayer. all pieces of a quiet promise, to serve with honor, to live with purpose, to walk through this world not as a conqueror, but as a guardian. And now the stream bends again, carrying us from paths of war to roads of faith once more. Not to monasteries this time, but to journeys, spiritual quests, holy footsteps, dusty roads lined with prayer and hope. We follow the current to pilgrimages, to travelers moving not for trade or conquest, but for grace. The stream bends softly now, and as it turns, we find ourselves no longer beside castles or fields, but on winding roads, narrow, dusty, and lined with the quiet footsteps of travelers. But these are no ordinary travelers. They walk not for profit, not for glory, but for grace. With staffs in hand, cloaks drawn close, and hearts open wide, they move forward with one destination in mind, the holy. These are pilgrims, ordinary men and women on extraordinary journeys, and their paths, like streams converging from every corner of the land, lead to sacred places, shrines, cathedrals, relics, and wonders. We follow them now, step by gentle step. In medieval Europe, pilgrimage was more than travel. It was a spiritual voyage, a sacred ritual of body and soul. To undertake a pilgrimage was to surrender to uncertainty, to embrace the road with all its hardships, in the hope of finding something greater at journey's end. For some, that hope was healing, a child's fever, a mother's blindness, a pain too deep for physicians. For others, it was forgiveness, a sin unshakable, a past mistake, a guilt that clung like shadow. And for many, it was simply faith, a longing to walk where saints once walked, to kneel where miracles had bloomed, to feel closer to the divine. Pilgrimage sites dotted the landscape like pearls on a rosary. Each one shimmered with sacred meaning. In Spain, Santiago de Compostela, the final resting place of St. James, drew pilgrims from across Europe, following the famed Camino. In England, there was Canterbury, where Thomas Becket's martyrdom turned cathedral into sanctuary. In France, Chartres, with its magnificent cathedral, welcomed those drawn by beauty and devotion. And in the Holy Land, Jerusalem stood, distant, dangerous, yet glowing in the hearts of countless believers who longed to tread where Christ had lived and died. The journey itself was as sacred as the destination. Pilgrims often walked hundreds of miles, through forests, over mountains, across rivers and plains. They traveled in groups for safety, or alone for reflection. Some were rich, riding horses and guarded by servants. Most were poor, with little more than sandals, a cloak, and a satchel of bread. Along the way, they slept in monasteries, inns, or barns. They faced rain, hunger, blisters, and thieves. They were often tested by pain, by fear, by doubt. But with each step, something deepened: their faith, their humility, their understanding of themselves and the world. A pilgrimage was not a race. It was a surrender to the pace of one's feet, to the silence between footsteps, to the unknown ahead. And so we walk with them. The early morning mist wraps around the road like a soft shawl. Birdsong greets the first light. The air smells of dew and distant wood smoke. Each footfall is a prayer, each breath a hymn. The road becomes a ribbon of devotion, stretching behind and ahead, winding across a continent stitched together by faith. Some pilgrims carry symbols, scallop shells, worn crosses, pouches of relics. Others wear simple robes marked with a red cross, or badges from shrines visited. Their destination is not always visible, but always felt, like a current pulling gently forward. Pilgrimage was also a social journey. On the road, rich and poor walked side by side. A knight might share bread with a beggar. A noblewoman might be helped across a river by a farmer. The journey softened pride, erased status, taught cooperation. For here, on the road, all were simply seekers, and stories were shared around campfires, of visions, of regrets, of miracles witnessed and lives transformed. In this way, pilgrimage became a moving community, a family formed not by blood, but by belief. Some pilgrims never reached their destination. They fell ill, were robbed, turned back by storm or war. And yet, even these journeys were honored. Because in pilgrimage, it was not only the end that mattered, but the effort, the intention, the spirit of devotion in every mile traveled. And for those who reached their goal, a special joy awaited. To kneel before the shrine, to touch the sacred relic, to light a candle and feel, for one perfect moment, that all the struggle had led them here, for a reason. Tears often flowed, not of sorrow, but of release, of peace, like rain finally falling after a long drought. And when the pilgrim turned to go home, they returned not the same. They walked now with lighter hearts, with stories etched into their bones, with new gratitude for the ordinary, a familiar tree, a favorite meal, a family embrace. They brought back holy water, trinkets, tokens, but the greatest gift was invisible, a quiet change within, a shift of soul, a deepening of the inner well. Not all saw pilgrimage with soft eyes. Some feared it, some exploited it. There were fraudulent relics, greedy innkeepers, even professional pilgrims who traveled for profit, not prayer. And yet, despite flaws, the pilgrimage endured. Because, at its heart, it was never about perfect shrines or perfect people. It was about the act of seeking, the willingness to step outside one's comfort, to walk toward something sacred, even without knowing what exactly one might find. The Church blessed these journeys. Pilgrims could receive special indulgences, spiritual rewards, believed to reduce time in purgatory or cleanse sins. Some wore special robes or hoods. Others had documents proving their intent. Monasteries offered free beds. Towns built hospitals just for pilgrims. Markets sprang up near shrines. Pilgrimage, then, was both a personal and public act. It changed lives, but it also shaped communities. Trade routes aligned with pilgrimage paths. Art, music, and literature were inspired by pilgrim stories. And cities, once quiet, grew into centers of devotion and commerce, fueled by the faithful who passed through their gates. Let us now sit beside the road and watch them pass. An old man limping with grace, a woman humming psalms beneath her breath, a group of children clutching bread and laughter. Their shadows lengthen in the golden light. And the road, worn, blessed, eternal, winds on. Tonight, as you rest, let yourself become the pilgrim. Close your eyes, feel the dust on your feet, the sun on your shoulders, the ache in your muscles, and the peace in your soul. You walk not for distance, but for meaning. You carry no map, only faith. And wherever your journey ends, know that every step, every pause, every silent prayer whispered to the wind was part of the sacred, part of something larger than yourself, part of the river of time, flowing toward light. And now, as we leave these holy roads behind, we hear the stream stir again. The waters whisper of conflict, of distant lands, of swords raised not for defense, but for conquest wrapped in faith. We approach now the merging of tides, where idealism meets ambition, where pilgrimage becomes crusade, where the gentle flow turns briefly turbulent. The current turns again. The soft flow of sacred roads and peaceful pilgrimages begins to stir. The wind picks up. The water no longer mirrors only still skies. It begins to ripple, to churn, to darken beneath the surface. We have arrived at a historical crossroads, where faith meets force, where longing for heaven is wrapped in steel, where the same devotion that walked toward peace now rides toward war. This is the age of the Crusades, a time when countless men and women set their eyes toward distant lands, believing they journeyed not for conquest, but for God. And as the waters swell and merge, we explore this chapter of history with care, with calm, and with compassion for every soul swept into its tide. The Crusades were a series of military campaigns that began in the late 11th century, stretching for nearly 200 years. Their purpose, at least at first, was declared as noble: to reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control, and to ensure safe passage for Christian pilgrims. But beneath the banners and blessings, the Crusades were complex, woven from threads of power, fear, faith, hope, misunderstanding, ambition, and loss. They were not one simple war, but a river of conflicts, sometimes righteous, sometimes reckless. A moment where the current of history turned fast and unpredictable. It began in the year 1095. Pope Urban II, speaking to a great crowd at the Council of Clermont in France, called upon Christian nobles to take up arms. He described the suffering of Eastern Christians under Muslim rule. He spoke of sacred sites defiled, pilgrims attacked, relics endangered. He offered not gold or land, but something more powerful: a spiritual reward. Those who joined the fight, he declared, would receive a plenary indulgence, the forgiveness of sins, and the promise of eternal salvation. This was not war for empire. It was framed as war for the soul. The call was heard far and wide. Nobles, knights, peasants, monks, merchants, tens of thousands answered, not with politics in their minds, but with crosses stitched to their cloaks and fire in their hearts. It became known as the First Crusade. They set out in waves, some organized, some chaotic, marching east through Europe toward Constantinople, then on to the Levant. The journey was long, the weather cruel, supplies scarce. And as with all things in motion, some were swept into tragedy before they ever reached their destination. Yet the First Crusade achieved what few expected. In 1199, after a brutal siege, Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders. They wept, they prayed, they knelt in the streets. They believed they had fulfilled the will of God, but the cost was great. The conquest was not clean. Blood stained the city's stones. Both Muslims and Jews suffered. And though the holy city had changed hands, it had not found peace. Instead, a cycle had begun. A cycle of taking and retaking, of advancing and retreating, of faith wrapped in fear, and faith misused. In the decades that followed, more crusades were launched. The second, the third, the fourth, and others, both major and minor. Some sought to reinforce Christian strongholds in the East. Others veered off course, such as the Fourth Crusade, which, in a tragic twist, sacked Constantinople, a Christian city, instead of reaching Jerusalem. Children were even swept into the tide, led by wandering preachers, in what came to be called the Children's Crusade. Thousands set out from France and Germany. Many never returned. Each crusade was different, but all were shaped by the same uneasy blend of devotion, politics, hope, and violence. Let us pause here, by the banks of this restless chapter, and reflect. Why did so many go? Some sought salvation. They truly believed this was their path to eternal peace. Others were moved by fear, of damnation, or of Muslim expansion. Some were driven by honor, a desire to protect fellow Christians, or to live out the chivalric code. There were also those who went for wealth, for adventure, for escape. Motives, like river currents, are rarely pure or singular. They mix, they twist, they change with time. And so too did the Crusades. The Muslim world, though divided at times, eventually united in resistance. Leaders like Saladin emerged, wise, strategic, and devout. Under his command, Jerusalem was retaken in 1187. Yet, unlike the earlier conquest, his reclaiming of the city was measured. He allowed many Christians to leave peacefully and protected many who stayed. His name echoed not only in Islamic history, but in European tales as well, where even enemies spoke of him with admiration. Because sometimes, even in war, respect survives. The Crusades also left echoes far beyond the battlefield. They opened routes of trade, exposing Europe to spices, silk, mathematics, and medicine from the East. They deepened divisions between Christians and Muslims, between Eastern and Western Christians, between church and state. They gave rise to new orders of knights, such as the Templars and Hospitallers, blending faith and warfare, and they stirred both inspiration and grief, depending on where one stood and what one saw. For the ordinary crusader, the journey was often heartbreaking. They faced disease, hunger, desert heat, mountains, long separations from home, death not only in battle, but in silence and solitude. Many never reached Jerusalem. Many more died on the way back. And yet, they walked, they fought, they believed. Their faces are lost to history, their names forgotten. But in the long, slow river of the past, their ripples remain. Today, we look back with a fuller view. We see the tragedy, the human cost, the flawed vision of divine will paired with the blade. But we also see a truth, that the Crusades were not the product of one mind or one culture. They were the result of many streams, religious fervor, cultural misunderstanding, noble idealism, political fear. And in that mix, we glimpse not only the danger of righteous certainty, but the need, still present today, for deeper understanding. Let us now drift away from these turbulent waters. Let the swords fall silent. Let the banners lower. Let the dust settle. Not every chapter in history soothes. Some stir. Some shake us awake. But even then, the current continues. Even after storms, rivers find calm again. And so, from conflict, the waves smoothen out, bringing us back to quieter shores, where minds turn not to war, but to wonder, to light streaming through stained glass, to cathedrals climbing toward heaven, to paint, stone, and sacred geometry. We move now from the edge of the sword to the edge of art. The water stills. After the tremble of distant battle, the river calms once more, its surface smooth, its pace unhurried. The clamor of war recedes like thunder beyond the hills, and now something else rises. Beauty, not loud, but strong, not fleeting, but lasting, born not of power, but of praise. This is the era of medieval art and architecture, a time when stone was lifted not for conquest, but for reverence, and brushstrokes told stories no tongue could fully express. We arrive now on the quiet shores of human creativity. In this chapter of the Middle Ages, faith did not ride into battle. It rose into the sky. It bloomed in frescoes, glowed through stained glass, echoed in carved wood, and soared in vaults of stone. And though few could read or write, everyone understood art, because it spoke in light and line, in color and curve, in shadow and silence. And so the current carries us gently now, from canvas to column, from chapel wall to cathedral spire. We begin in the 10th and 11th centuries in the world of Romanesque architecture, the first great style to rise after the fall of Rome. These buildings were not delicate, they were anchored. Their walls were thick, sometimes several meters. Their arches rounded like river stones. Their towers stood like sentinels, steady and strong. Romanesque churches and abbeys seemed to say, "Here, you are safe. Here, God is a fortress." Dark inside, these spaces offered shade, solemnity, and stillness. Windows were small, often just slits. Columns bore carvings of saints, beasts, or vines, each telling a tale. Above, barrel vaults curved like caves of quiet worship. This was a world carved in stone, solid, certain, and enduring. And yet, within those strong walls, wonder still bloomed. Artists of this time painted frescoes, murals on plaster that dried into permanence. They painted not for decoration, but for devotion. The Last Supper, the Crucifixion, the lives of saints. Not realistic, but symbolic. Faces wide-eyed, hands raised in prayer, bodies flat but radiant. They told stories for the illiterate, stories that echoed with morality, mystery, and meaning. Their purpose was not to impress the eye, but to move the soul. Stoneworkers chiseled biblical scenes onto doorways and capitals. A traveler arriving at a cathedral would see heaven and hell carved in sharp relief above the entry. Reminders that this threshold was not just of wood and iron, but of eternity. The Romanesque age carved faith into form. It made the invisible feel solid. It taught that God was mighty and near. But then, in the 12th century, the river of inspiration changed course again, and with it came a new vision of the divine. Gone were low ceilings and heavy stones. Now, churches would rise, climb, soar. This was the age of the Gothic cathedral. If Romanesque whispered of God's shelter, Gothic shouted of his glory. Gothic architecture was a miracle of both engineering and imagination. Walls no longer bore the full weight of the building. That job now belonged to flying buttresses, arched supports that reached out like wings. This allowed for taller walls, larger windows, and more light. The goal was clear: to fill these holy spaces with divine radiance. And nothing captured that more than stained glass. Imagine stepping into a Gothic cathedral. It is vast, cool. The air smells of incense and thyme. You look up, and the ceiling arches like the sky. And then you turn toward the window. Sunlight passes through colored glass, deep blues, radiant reds, golden yellows. It spills onto the stone floor like liquid jewel tones, and there, in that kaleidoscope of light, you see stories. The creation of the world, the life of Christ, the martyrdom of saints. Each panel a page, each color a verse, each ray a whisper of heaven. This is not just architecture, it is theology made visible. It is faith captured in color. Gothic cathedrals were also musical instruments of stone. Their tall naves created echoes that made even a single voice feel like a choir of angels. The organ's notes filled the space like wind in the branches of a sacred forest. Bells tolled from towers, marking time not just for prayer, but for the rhythm of entire cities. And every part of the structure had meaning. The cross-shaped floor plan, echoing the crucifixion. The rose window, symbolizing eternity. The vertical lines, always drawing the eye and the spirit upward. Sculpture, too, found its golden age. Gothic sculptors carved saints and apostles, not stiff and distant, but alive. Faces showed sorrow, wonder, peace, pain. Folds in robes rippled like water, and between them, gargoyles, grotesque guardians, part monster, part myth. Some believed they scared away evil. Others said they reminded people of the world outside, the wild, the wicked, the strange. All of it belonged. All of it had meaning, because in this art nothing was accidental. And yet, not all Gothic art was grand. In quiet corners, illuminated manuscripts continued to flourish. Monks and scribes, still working in monasteries and universities, painted books by hand. Gold leaf shimmered on pages. Margins danced with vines, dragons, and angels. Each letter a miniature masterpiece. These books, Bibles, psalters, calendars, were not only read, they were prayed. Outside of churches, art grew more personal. Tapestries hung in noble halls, woven scenes of hunts, legends, and daily life. Jewelry carried tiny relics. Ivory combs were carved with care. Even everyday objects, chests, bowls, spoons, became canvases for creativity. Because beauty was not reserved for kings or priests. It flowed through all levels of life. In gardens, in pottery, in lace, in lullabies sung beside fires, in stories carved on walking sticks. Art was not only for awe, it was for connection. And while most artists' names are lost to time, their work endures. A cathedral still catches the sun in Paris. A mosaic still shimmers in Ravenna. A sculpture still smiles in Chartres. They left no signatures, because the work was not about them. It was about offering to God, to the community, to the future. They carved for love. They painted for reverence. They built for those they would never meet. So now, as we drift along these sacred galleries of time, let us pause. Let us feel the silence inside a cathedral. Let us trace our fingers across carved stone. Let us close our eyes and let colored light fall on our faces. Because medieval art, at its heart, is not a relic of the past, it is a reminder that even in hardship the human spirit rises, that even in darkness we create light, that faith is not only preached, it is built, painted, sung, and felt. And now the stream flows on, from the sacred spaces of cathedrals to the stone halls of learning, from creativity to curiosity. We move next to the medieval universities, to scholars and scribes, to ink and inquiry, where minds, once quiet, begin to stir, and the world of ideas awakens once more. The current deepens. We have drifted through the art-filled arches of cathedrals, past tapestries of devotion and carved stone windows lit with stories. Now, the water changes once again, still peaceful, but wider, still quiet, but rich beneath the surface. This is not the current of armies or towers. It is the slow, thoughtful movement of the mind. We arrive now at the medieval university, a place where curiosity took root in sacred soil, where minds once turned only to prayer now stretched toward understanding, where questions bloomed, and knowledge began to flow like streams feeding into a mighty river. And so, we float softly into this next chapter of the Middle Ages, an age not only of worship or war, but of learning. It began humbly, not in grand marble halls or manicured courtyards, but in the cloisters of monasteries and the echoing chambers of cathedral schools. In the 9th and 10th centuries, monks and clerics studied sacred texts, not to challenge, but to preserve. They copied, they translated, they taught, they became the stewards of what remained from the ancient world. But soon, the questions grew, not to doubt God, but to understand His creation. What is the nature of light? What are the laws that govern the stars? How do plants grow? Why do bodies fall ill? And what does justice mean? From these questions, the seeds of the university were planted. By the 12th and 13th centuries, those seeds began to bloom. The first true universities appeared, not as buildings, but as communities. Communities of teachers and students gathering wherever they could, cathedrals, city squares, private homes. Their goal was not entertainment or wealth. Their goal was truth. And like pilgrims of the intellect, they journeyed toward it with books as their walking sticks and reason as their compass. Let us enter one now. A cold stone room, wooden benches, the smell of ink and wax. A teacher stands at a raised pulpit, his voice steady. Students, young men from near and far, listen, scribble notes, lean forward. There are no projectors, no chalkboards, only minds lit by quiet fire. This is the rhythm of medieval scholarship. The first great universities, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and Cambridge, became centers of learning across Europe. Each had its specialty. Bologna, in Italy, became the heart of legal studies. Paris excelled in theology and philosophy. Oxford and Cambridge grew into rival towers of logic and thought. These places were more than schools. They were living rivers of intellect, drawing students from across kingdoms. To walk into a medieval university was to walk into a tide of languages: Latin, French, Arabic, Greek. A mingling of ideas, a meeting of minds. The subjects they studied were called the 7 liberal arts, divided into 2 categories: the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric; the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These were the foundations. From them, students moved on to medicine, law, and theology, the highest pursuit of all. But even in theological study, new tools emerged: philosophy, debate, reason, logic. Faith was still central, but now it was examined, explored, questioned gently, not to tear down, but to understand deeper. This was the spirit of the university, to unite the heart's belief with the mind's inquiry. And not all knowledge was born in Europe. Medieval scholars reached outward, translating Arabic texts, studying works preserved in the Muslim world during Europe's quieter centuries. They read Avicenna on medicine, Averroes on Aristotle. They borrowed mathematics from India, astronomy from Persia, and geometry from Egypt. Ideas flowed across borders like wind through leaves. And in that exchange, Europe stirred from its intellectual slumber. It was not a sudden awakening, but a gentle stretching, a yawn of thought, a light flickering to life in many corners. Medieval professors used a method called lectio et disputatio. First, the lecture, where a teacher would read a text aloud, explaining line by line. Then the disputation, a structured debate, where students asked questions, offered answers, challenged ideas respectfully. The goal was not to win. It was to understand more fully. In this way, every idea was tested, weighed, turned like a river stone in the hand. And truth, if it could be found, would shine brighter for having been polished. The universities had no uniforms, but you could always tell a scholar. He wore a long robe, often black, sometimes hooded. He carried a satchel filled with parchment and ink, and his fingers, ink-stained, calloused, told the tale of long nights spent under candlelight, copying, learning, thinking. Most students were young men of wealth or noble birth, but over time, more and more came from humbler roots, sons of merchants, millers, and masons, drawn by the promise of knowledge. Some would become priests, other doctors, some judges, some scribes, all of them seekers, each one a droplet in the growing river of European thought. And what of the women? Though rare, some found their way into learning. In convents, many nuns received fine educations. Some became renowned for their wisdom. Hildegard of Bingen, for instance, was a visionary, healer, composer, and theologian. Her writings still echo today, gentle waves from a time long past. Women were not welcomed in the universities, but they learned anyway, in the margins, in silence, in courage. Not all agreed with this new tide of inquiry. Some feared it. They saw reason as a threat to faith. Books, they warned, could lead people away from Scripture. But others believed the opposite. That reason, rightly guided, could lead closer to God. That understanding creation could deepen one's awe of the Creator. This delicate balance between belief and logic, between spirit and science, defined the medieval university. It was not a battle. It was a conversation, a dialogue still continuing today. And so, as the centuries flowed forward, knowledge grew. The universities endured. Some fell, others rose, all of them shaped by students and teachers whose names are lost to time. But their ideas lived on. Ideas about justice, biology, medicine, philosophy, mathematics, and ethics. Ideas that fed the coming Renaissance. Ideas that would one day light the Enlightenment. Ideas that still whisper from the pages of old books. To every new mind that listens. Let us pause now and picture the scholar, bent over his desk, candle flickering, quill in hand. The night is silent. Outside, the town sleeps. But inside, something moves. A thought, a question, a truth, almost grasped. He is tired. But he writes on. Because for him, and for us, learning is a river that never dries. And now, as we drift onward, the waters deepen again, not with knowledge, but with sorrow, not with ink, but with illness. The medieval world was not spared suffering. It was touched by famine, by plague, by fear. And so, the stream carries us next to darker waters, not to dwell in pain, but to witness how even in hardship, the current continues. The river slows. Its once bright surface dims beneath clouds. The air grows heavier. The trees along the banks lean low, and the sound of laughter and learning fades behind us. We drift now into darker waters. Every journey, even the calmest, must pass through shadow. And so too must our story of medieval Europe move through the trials that tested its people beyond measure. These are the years of famine, of plague, of fear so thick it clung to every doorpost, every bell toll, every breath. And yet, through it all, the river did not stop. It carried grief, it carried prayers, but it also carried survival. It began before the Black Death, before the world trembled under the weight of disease. The 14th century opened not with fanfare, but with hunger. From 1315 to 1317, a series of cold, wet years swept across Europe. Crops failed. Livestock died. Roads turned to mud. Granaries emptied. This was the Great Famine. A quiet catastrophe. No flames, no battles, just skies that refused to shine. Villagers watched their seeds rot in the soil. Fields once golden with grain stood gray and bare. Peasants pulled bark from trees, boiled roots, ate cats, dogs, rats. Some whispered of cannibalism. Whether true or not, the fear alone chilled the soul. Bread, once a humble staple, became a memory. Children cried and then fell silent. The poor suffered most, but even nobles felt the sting. Hunger knows no titles, and as food vanished, so did trust. Markets turned hostile, prices soared. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. Desperation does not ask permission, it simply arrives. The church prayed. Bells rang, people fasted, ironically, in a time of forced starvation. And then, after 2 years, the skies cleared. The rains eased, crops returned. But the people did not forget. A scar had formed in Europe's memory, a warning that life, once assumed, could vanish with the clouds. But that warning was only the beginning. For just a few decades later, another shadow crossed the land. Not gray, like famine, but black, swift, relentless, unseen. It arrived by sea, by flea, by fate, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, a name etched into history with grief. Between 1347 and 1351, it swept across Europe like a storm without mercy. It came from the east, carried by trade ships, rats, and the invisible breath of the sick. It entered ports quietly and then exploded across countryside and city. No village was too small, no castle too strong, no monastery too holy. The plague reached them all. At first, people did not understand. A cough, a fever, then swelling in the groin or neck, black bulbous lumps called buboes, bleeding, vomiting, delirium, and then, within days, silence. Entire families vanished in a week. Priests walked street to street, offering last rites. Doctors, those who remained, donned beaked masks filled with herbs, hoping the scent would drive the poison away. But the sickness did not listen. They buried the dead in mass graves, not with ceremony, just with haste. The living dug pits by night, then filled them by dawn. So many were lost that names were forgotten, homes abandoned, memories dissolved. It is believed that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population died. In just 4 years. Let the weight of that settle. Imagine walking down a road and seeing every second person gone. Entire villages empty. Streets once busy with markets silent. Cathedrals echoing with unanswered prayers. And in the face of such horror, people responded in many ways. Some turned to faith, more devout than ever. They marched in groups, whipping themselves in penance, begging God for forgiveness. Others turned to blame. Scapegoats were sought. Jews, foreigners, the poor, even lepers. Many were wrongly accused, persecuted, killed. Fear has a way of drowning reason. Even the wise struggled to explain what was happening. Was it punishment? A test? A reckoning? Or simply nature, indifferent to suffering? Some fled the cities, hoping the countryside might offer peace. Others locked their doors and waited, hoping the breath of strangers would not find them. Families closed themselves inside for weeks, living in silence and hope. Some turned wild with despair. Parties, wine, abandon. If death was certain, why not laugh while there was time? But amid the darkness, a strange thing happened. Life continued, not untouched, not unscarred, but stubborn. Some survived. Children, once silent from famine, grew again. Villages rebuilt, markets reopened, and slowly, very slowly, the river of time began to flow again. And in that silence after the storm, something changed. With so many gone, labor became scarce. Peasants demanded better wages. Some left the land and entered towns. Serfdom began to crack. A new individual awareness rose, an understanding that life was short, fragile, and precious. The church, once the unshakable pillar, was questioned. How could so many die? Why were prayers unanswered? Was faith still enough? And so, out of tragedy, thought began to stir. And out of despair, change began to ripple. Artists painted skeletons dancing with the living, reminders of mortality. Poets wrote verses about the brevity of life. Doctors began observing, recording, studying, not just praying. In the dark soil left by the plague, new seeds were sown. Seeds of transformation, of questioning, of curiosity. The very seeds that would one day bloom into the Renaissance. And so we remember this chapter not just for its sorrow, but for its resilience. For the mothers who kept their children safe. For the monks who stayed behind to care for the dying. For the farmers who planted again. For the hands that held one another when the world felt like it was ending. Let us drift now past the mass graves. Let us lower our voices, remove our hats, not in fear, but in respect. Because though this chapter is dark, it is not the end. It is the bend in the river, a bend that leads toward the light, toward recovery, toward rebirth, toward the closing chapters of the medieval world, and the dawn of something new. And so, we float on, carried by the same waters that once ran cold with sorrow, now warming once again. We approach the late Middle Ages, a time of transformation, of endings and beginnings, where the river begins to open into the sea. The river widens, its current still slow, but steady. The shadows of famine and plague stretch behind us like fog lifting at dawn. The tolling bells grow fainter. In their place, new sounds begin to rise. A distant hammer, a voice reading aloud, a pen scratching quietly across parchment. We have entered the late Middle Ages, a time when old certainties began to soften and new shapes formed on the horizon. This was not yet the Renaissance, but it was the beginning of change, a season of transition, a twilight before dawn. And so we drift now through a Europe that still remembers pain, but also begins to imagine possibility. The 14th and 15th centuries were marked by contradiction, grief and growth, collapse and creativity. Wars still raged, plague still returned, but something had shifted, deep beneath the surface, like roots spreading unseen through soil. People had endured the unendurable, and in doing so, they had learned to question, to adapt, to hope. The feudal order, once firm as carved stone, began to crack. The bonds between lord and serf, tightened by duty for centuries, began to loosen. With so many lives lost during the plague, labor became scarce. And when something becomes scarce, it becomes valuable. Peasants realized they could demand more: wages, rights, freedom to move. Some walked away from the fields and into towns. Others revolted, seeking justice or relief. In England, the peasants' revolt of 1381 thundered with the cry of the unheard. Though not all demands were met, the message was clear. The world was changing, and the power to shape it no longer belonged only to kings and bishops. Trade also surged once again, stronger now, more daring. Merchants sailed further. Goods flowed across mountains and seas. Italian city-states like Florence, Venice, and Genoa became hubs of art, banking, diplomacy, and discovery. Markets swelled with spices, silk, and ideas. Ideas, especially, could not be taxed nor chained. They passed from lips to lips, carried by scholars, artists, sailors, and strangers. The Mediterranean shimmered not only with sun, but with exchange. The church, too, began to shift. Still powerful, still revered, but no longer unquestioned. The devastation of the plague had shaken belief. And growing corruption within the church, lavish lifestyles, political power plays, conflicting popes, caused many to doubt its purity. Movements for reform stirred. Voices rose, soft at first, then louder. Some called for a return to simplicity, others for scripture to be translated into common tongues. Faith remained, but trust wavered. And in that space between belief and authority, new thoughts took root. Thoughts that would one day lead to reformation and revolution. And still, education expanded. The universities we met earlier grew in number and size. Books, once copied by hand, began to be printed, thanks to the invention of the movable type printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440. This single innovation would change the course of history. Suddenly, a book was not a treasure for the elite, but a tool for the many. Knowledge no longer flowed in narrow streams. It became a flood of literacy, of language, of learning. And with it came voice, the voice of the common man. the voice of the thinking woman, the voice of future ages, whispering first in these final years of the medieval world. Even in art and architecture, the styles began to evolve. The pointed arches of Gothic design remained, but softened. Human figures in paintings grew more expressive, more individual. Perspective was discovered. Light was studied. Landscapes appeared. The divine was still central, but so too was the human. A child laughing, a mother weeping, a scholar thinking. These were now worthy subjects, because the medieval mind had begun to shift, not away from God, but toward the world around them. Politics changed too. Kings began to consolidate power, forming stronger central governments. Nations like France and England emerged from feudal patchworks into early modern states. Borders mattered more. Languages grew distinct. Loyalties shifted from lords to crowns. War remained, a constant undercurrent. The 100 Years' War between England and France raged from 1337 to 1453, leaving scars and stories across generations. Yet, out of the struggle, new strength emerged. New weapons, new armies, new ideas of nationhood. And with each passing decade, the feudal chessboard lost its grip. The medieval game was nearly done. But it did not end with a crash. It ended with a curve, a slow, graceful bend of the river. Those born in 1350 still lived medieval lives, by candlelight, by plough, by prayer. But their grandchildren saw the horizon differently. They painted it. They wrote of it. They sailed toward it. The late Middle Ages was a threshold. 1 foot in the past, 1 foot reaching forward. And though the bridge ahead was not yet fully built, the foundation was laid. In ink, in stone, in thought, in quiet rebellion, in the hearts of people who had lived through plague, hunger, and war, and still chose to sing, to build, to learn. Let us now pause here, by the water's edge, and look out at the open sea. We do not step into it yet, but we see it. We smell the salt. We hear the waves. And we know something is ending, and something is beginning. The Middle Ages, a time of hardship, yes, but also of endurance, beauty, structure, faith, and creativity, draws gently to its close. And like every river, it does not die. It simply merges with something larger. A new current, a new name, a new chapter. And so, we drift slowly toward the final turn, toward the dawn of the Renaissance, a time when the old becomes new again, when light returns in new colors, when curiosity no longer whispers, but sings. The river begins to widen now. Its banks stretch far apart. The current is steady, but no longer confined. The land we've passed, marked by castles, cathedrals, fields, and sorrow, is now behind us. The sky opens wider. The air softens. Ahead lies the sea. And with it, the closing of a chapter written in prayer, stone, silence, and survival. We have reached the end of the Middle Ages, a time not lost, but fulfilled. A season of humanity that weathered darkness and still built toward light. And now, as this medieval stream flows into the ocean of the modern world, we look back, not in haste, but in gratitude. It began with the fall of an empire. It ends with the rise of something new. Where once stood feudal lords and monastic scribes, now walk explorers, scientists, poets, and painters. The age of faith does not disappear, it changes shape. The divine is still revered, but now the human takes center stage too. Not in rebellion, but in rediscovery. It is as if the people of Europe, after centuries of looking upward toward heaven, now turn their gaze inward, to the soul, to the mind, to the world around them. This is the beginning of the Renaissance, a rebirth in name and spirit. a time when the knowledge preserved in monasteries is read with new eyes, when the questions asked in universities are sharpened by experience, when the ink once used to copy scripture is now used to write philosophy, poetry, anatomy, and astronomy. Leonardo sketches the heart. Copernicus watches the stars. Michelangelo carves human form from stone with the same reverence once reserved for saints. And in Florence, Venice, Paris, and beyond, people speak not only of salvation, but of potential. The world is no longer just a test of the soul. It is a canvas, a stage, a question, an invitation. And yet, the Middle Ages are not lost in this new era. They are its foundation, its root system, its memory. The cathedrals still stand. The bells still ring. The manuscripts still whisper their sacred lines. And in every great idea born in the Renaissance, there is a shadow of the past. A monk who copied the text. A knight who defended the peace. A farmer who fed the towns. A midwife who helped bring life into a dark world. A painter who once filled chapels with visions of heaven. Each one, known or unknown, helped carry the world forward. Their footsteps, worn into stone, now form the path others walk. It is easy to look back on the Middle Ages and see only darkness, the plagues, the wars, the chains of feudalism, the fire of crusades. But that is not the whole story. Look closer, and you will see. The quiet patience of farmers planting fields for a harvest they might never see. The gentle brush strokes of monks illuminating books with gold and devotion. The hands that raised stone toward the heavens, one block at a time. The voices that sang hymns in candlelit halls, asking for nothing more than peace. These were not the shadows of history. They were its light, subtle, enduring, human. As we reach the river's mouth, we drift gently now. No rushing, no urgency, only reflection. The end of the Middle Ages is not a wall but a threshold, a place where one rhythm ends and another begins, where the world, after centuries of struggle, finds its breath again. A long, deep breath, filled with memory, filled with hope, filled with something new. The printing press hums, ships are built sturdier, cities hum with invention. And across Europe, a question rises. What more is possible? That question would guide the next age, the age of Da Vinci and Descartes, of Luther and Galileo, of voyages and revolutions. But its roots were here, in the prayers of a widow, in the courage of a knight, in the silence of a monastery, in the dust of the road, in the ink of a forgotten hand. And so we drift onward, leaving the calm waters of medieval Europe behind, not with sadness, but with honor. We have seen what the world was, and what it could endure, and what it quietly dreamed to become. Close your eyes now. Imagine the bells ringing softly in a distant village, the smell of bread rising from an old oven, the echo of footsteps in a stone cloister, the ripple of a cloak on a quiet road, the flicker of candlelight in a wooden church, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the soft, steady prayer of a woman alone in her garden. All of it, part of the great stream of time. All of it, real, enduring, sacred. And now, dear traveler, the journey comes to rest. The river has delivered you, from the fall of Rome to the rise of cities, from feudal fields to cathedral towers, from famine and plague to awakening. You have walked beside farmers, monks, knights, pilgrims, scholars, and artists. You have heard their stories, felt their rhythms, shared their silence, and now you return home, carried gently on the current of memory. The journey does not end. It simply becomes another chapter, in a book still being written, in a river still flowing, in a world still reaching for the light. And so, we drift onward, peacefully, gratefully, together.